Hello, everyone. I'm Nick Hawkins, Senior Director of Product Management for Akamai based in Singapore. Thank you for joining us in this webinar today. What I'd like to go through in this session is give you Akamai's perspective on phishing. I think it's a topic that is very relevant right now, and it's probably a topic that from a cybersecurity perspective has not been receiving maybe the same level of focus that it should. So I wanted to give you an update on that and give you some potential ideas and thoughts on prevention strategies to help improve the security of your user base. I'll just share a few slides here, so just bear with me. So what I wanted to go through in this session is really look at the business that has built up around phishing. I think many people don't realize that the phishing industry actually has an economy all of its own. And one of the reasons for that is that I think phishing is a widely spread threat. If you have a successful phishing campaign, you can reach and effectively hook many, many people very, very quickly and easily. It can be quite an effective way of gathering appropriate personal information. And phishing can be anything from just trying to get a username or a username and password combination, all the way through to potentially delivering malware and compromising an endpoint to then gain a foothold in a network to do further exploration and penetration and potentially compromise of systems. As I say, phishing is very much a viable economy in the dark web, and I'll take you through some of the components that are available for sale, the factories that are built up around that, and the economic forces that are driving some of these phishing activities. And I think one thing that we need to be very aware of is that phishing has become quite sophisticated. For many of us in cybersecurity, we think back to some of the early attempts at phishing, the courier company email or the please find your attached invoice email. It became very easy quite quickly to identify suspicious emails with dodgy attachments, and you knew that maybe somebody was trying to phish you. These days we're all, I think, attuned, certainly those of us in cybersecurity, that, if something looks too good to be true, then it probably is. But unfortunately, I think if we look at the user base, the general population of employees, unfortunately, there is still a certain level of ignorance, shall we say, within the user base as to the danger and the threat that phishing continues to present. Now, unfortunately, with challenging times like we have at the moment with the COVID-19 situation, those people who are of malicious intent, unfortunately, do take advantage of these kind of situations. And we've seen a significant uptick in COVID-19 related phishing opportunities, phishing emails, and so on. You can see a couple of the examples on the screen here. One news article quoted that there'd been nearly a 700% rise, 700% in phishing emails in under a month related to COVID-19. I'm based here in Singapore, and here's one example that I came across. Clearly, very typical phishing email, trying to take advantage of people's fear and concerns, trying to impose a sense of urgency and importance, and use that as an opportunity for maybe an individual to let their guard down and to click through on a link or to open a document, whereas normally they might not be quite so susceptible to it. But with the current sort of psychological impact and pressures of the COVID-19 situation, there's an opportunity, I think, for scammers to catch people unaware and catch them in maybe a sort of a weakened mental state. So I think it's actually all the more important that we focus on phishing right now, given this increase in threats. And the figures still remain the same, as you can see with the second bullet point, that the vast majority of compromises typically start with some type of phishing attack, whether that is to gain credentials or to at least gain a username and then try and match that with common passwords, or whether it's actually used as an opportunity to do a drive-by and download malware to a system to give an attacker a foothold. So whilst I think phishing has not been a hot topic in cybersecurity. I think it's lost a little bit of its shine. I think it's a very timely and important subject that we cover right now, so that you're up to date with the latest challenges and also some of the tools that are available to help protect your users. So what we'll do in this presentation is we'll go through kind of I guess almost the whole phishing trail, looking at the threats and the landscape, talk a little bit about the business that is behind phishing, and then look at the details of how these phishing attacks are conducted, how they're distributed, and some of the functionality that powers them. Then we'll finish at looking at, if we have an understanding of these different stages, how can we then use that information to increase the level of protection to individuals within an enterprise organization. So let's look at the threat first of all. I mean, I think this is probably a good just recap or summary for all of us. We should all be very aware of really what phishing is. And ultimately, phishing is focused on compromise. It's about compromising an individual to gain something that is sensitive or private. That could be, and most commonly is, user credentials, which could be consumer credentials. But we shouldn't ignore the fact that phishing is not just a consumer challenging issue. Phishing is very definitely an enterprise issue, and we're, as I say, seeing an increase in targeted phishing that is focused specifically on trying to gain enterprise credentials. Again, taking advantage of that fear in the user base that potentially leads to a reduced level of vigilance when protecting your personal information. But phishing really could be anything. It's anything that has value on the dark web, which could be anything from a username and password combination through to financial information like bank account data or credit card information, or personal information such as tax ID number, ID card number, passport number, etc. All of those elements of information over time can obviously be combined to create bigger, better profile of individuals that can then be used for identity theft and other issues and challenges that obviously have financial gain behind them. So phishing, we need to think of both as an individual activity, but also as the first step in exploiting or a potential attack chain that has then additional components behind it. Now, if we look at the landscape of phishing, I think what we have seen is that it is a very large and persistent threat. Akamai did a study recently in our State of the Internet report, and I'll provide details of that later, where we analyzed nearly 200,000 URLs that were known to be compromised sites or phishing attempts. You can see that whilst the 2/3 of them were focused on consumers, basically 1/3 of those phishing URLs and those targeted attacks were absolutely focused on enterprise users and were targeted to try and relieve enterprise users of something from a company confidential perspective. Not surprisingly, financial services is the largest and most immediate target, with over half of those URLs being focused on FSI type organizations. But we do see a spread across other industries, and particularly high tech and other major global enterprises are always common targets for phishing attacks in the enterprise space. One of the other interesting factors that we identified, though, and this is looking then more at, if we have that understanding, how do we start to do some prevention, is that many of the phishing attacks and the tools, the technologies, the domains, etc., that are behind these phishing attempts are active for 20 days or less. And actually, you'll see with some further analysis later that particularly for enterprise targeted campaigns, the liveness of that campaign can be very, very short indeed, sometimes measured in hours rather than days. So you have a very small time window in which to potentially protect your users. So this is quite a challenge. You've got a large proportion of URLs focused on enterprise. You've got potentially working in an industry that's highly targeted, with phishing campaigns and toolkits that are active for only a very short period of time and therefore become a hard target to prevent against. Now, why are people doing this? I mean, I think, as we've said, that there is money to be made. There is financial value attached to any level of personal information, anything from a validated username and password combination, obviously through to more personal financial data. And there is a whole black market economy around the business of creating and executing phishing campaigns. If you start to go on the dark web, you can easily identify suppliers of things such as phishing kits. Phishing kits, I'll explain in a little more detail. They're really a way of easily creating a target website that you want to fool people into visiting and then trick them into giving up personal information. So there is money to be made in terms of the suppliers, and like anything in IT, there's a whole sort of network and chain of suppliers who provide the various components to make it easy for you if you want to create a phishing campaign, make it very easy for you to sort of set up and build and execute on this campaign. What we've actually seen is, rather than just also people selling the toolkits themselves, there are now sort of service providers on the web who will create and deliver the capability for you to execute a phishing campaign if you don't have the skill set yourself. The skill set required is actually pretty minimal. You can, with these dark web tools, you can actually build a flow chart of how you want that phishing site to look like, how the pages link, how you want to go through those potential steps to relieve an individual of that sensitive information. The tools are pretty cheap to own and obtain, and deploying is very, very simple. A lot of the tools are actually multilingual now, so you can run a campaign across multiple geographies at the same time. And again, these toolkits create content that potentially looks and replicates existing sites and does it with full responsive mobile and desktop support. So the output that comes from these tools is actually very, very professional in its appearance. And you can see from the flowchart example on the right-hand side, you can build quite a sophisticated phishing environment that looks like a very professional website, which again is all part of that building trust with a user to get them to believe that the location they're connecting to is genuine, and to then be willing to provide the personal information that the phishing campaigner is trying to access. In the past, I think phishing was typically a very one-dimensional activity. You had a site that was scraped from a bank or similar service, which had a username and password entry field. It had a logo and a bit of basic text, and that was kind of all that was on the phishing page. So it was relatively easy to spot. But now you can see with these toolkits, there's actually a very low skill level required to then be able to create what is quite a sophisticated output to try and use that to convince individuals to give up personal sensitive information. One of the interesting changes that we've seen is how phishing has switched in terms of the methods of delivery and enticement to persuade individuals to give up their information. Email from a phishing perspective has been around for basically as long as the internet has existed, and was very much the original and traditional distribution channel for phishing. I think what we've seen now is individuals, whilst not everybody has maybe as much vigilance as they should when it comes to looking at suspicious emails, I think individuals have become a little smarter at identifying potentially suspicious emails. And clearly there are a lot of services now delivered from cloud platforms that provide good inspection and identification of phishing emails. We also see that obviously with the browsers and some of the intelligence in the browsers and cloud-based services such as some of those from Akamai, where threat protection is done initially by looking at the DNS name that a user's trying to connect to. So all of that comes together to help, I think, protect users who are being approached with phishing via the email channel. But what we have seen is a significant growth in the use of social networks to push out additional phishing campaigns. Social networks are typically built on trust, and obviously phishing itself, there's a very large trust component that it relates to phishing and persuading an individual to provide sensitive data. So we've seen a significant growth in the use of social networks for the distribution and the enticement of phishing campaigns. One of the challenges I think with social media is it obviously bypasses that increased sophistication in the email security. The inspection that goes on there. It is very, very viral. I mean, we all know, I think, from anything that we've seen on social media, if something becomes a hit very quickly, it can spread very, very rapidly across a social media network. And there is typically an element of trust. If you can get one or two individuals supporting or tricked into giving you the data and maybe even supporting your campaign, which, and I'll show you how that works in a minute, obviously then each of those individuals has their own trusted network. They're more likely to be believed by people within their peer group that are part of their social media circle. And so that then creates an additional element of validation and trust, which is important for the success of a phishing campaign. So let's have a look in a little bit more detail around how some of this capability works, what the toolkits look like, etc. So one case study that I want to share, and I think this is very, very typical of the kind of output that you see from these phishing toolkits, is the 3 quiz questions case study. I'm sure all of you will have come across this kind of quiz on social media. And not surprisingly, it typically asks a set of 3 very simple questions. And no matter what questions you select, there's an enticement, there's a free gift, and everybody appears to be a winner. We've seen the same toolkits that are available on the dark web being used to abuse over 100 brands. One of the most common target areas is airline companies, because after all, who doesn't want free airline tickets? And the objective from this particular campaign is to get emails and personal information. If I have a user's email, then I potentially have a login data. I can potentially compare that information to other sources of data on the dark web, and I can check and validate if that user name has been used on a different site. I may have a potential password for that. So I can potentially end up with validated, usernames, emails, and passwords, which again have economic value when it comes to the financial services market and the dark web. So, just a sample example here of what such a case study quiz might look like. It's an airline. I'm offering free tickets. Have you ever traveled with us before? And you go through a simple 2 or 3 questions. And guess what? Of course, you've won 2 free tickets. So if you want to take advantage of this, you obviously have to give up additional personal information. Please provide us your email to enable us to send you your voucher. In some cases, maybe behind this, there's a fake airline site where it says, please create an account. So again, you're giving up maybe a username and password. And we all know the vast majority of users will reuse the same username and password across many sites. So you're potentially giving up that data that can then be validated on many other websites. And again, once you have a validated login, that has value. I'm excited that I've won free airline tickets. I want to tell all my friends, hey, I've got 2 free tickets. I can travel the world potentially. So of course I share this on my preferred social media network, and not surprisingly, the scammers, the phishing back end has already created fake social media messages that show that others have also won, again creating that impression of trust, that impression of legitimacy. And of course, if an individual who is a genuine user gets tricked and thinks that they've won and shares this, then that propagates the case study, propagates the quiz wider to the trusted network of that individual user, potentially enticing more individuals to give up their personal information. And of course, the more that we propagate through social networks, the more that's delivered through a trust network, the more likely it is that the individuals are going to give up that sensitive data. Again, you're relying here on everyone's desire to win something of value, in this case, free airline tickets. And that's why, we've seen this as a very, very sort of sophisticated and quite successful campaign in terms of phishing attempts to obtain at a minimum sort of email address information, but in some cases, email, username and password combinations to then be able to validate those on other websites and then resell them in the dark web. So really any phishing campaign sort of follows the same steps. In this case, it's a quiz, and typically a quiz is ideal to generate a sense of positivity within the individual, and then a willingness to be able to give up personal information. Because ultimately that is the goal of any phishing campaign, is obtaining sensitive information. Now this is a consumer example, but we do also see quite sophisticated campaigns, which I'll share in a minute, in the enterprise space as well. And I'll give some examples of what those look like. But it's all based on the same premise, the same key factors. Trust is very important. Trust and validation and legitimacy are really what enables phishing campaigns to succeed. So what have we learned so far from all of this? Phishing is definitely going to continue. We cannot ignore phishing. It's not going to go away. And as we've seen with the recent COVID-19 situation, actually phishing continues to increase because scammers will always try and take advantage of any situation and the potential that people will let their guard down. Social networks are only going to grow as a distribution channel. They are a trust-based network and hence have significant value to phishing campaigners. We cannot, I think, ignore the fact that phishing kits and the tools and the tactics that are used are getting more and more sophisticated. They're developed and released very, very quickly. And the lifespan of the domains that are used is very often measured in hours. It's not in days or in weeks now. Campaigns are very, very targeted. And as I've said already, they are very sophisticated to gain that end user trust. So with all of this sort of background, we need to take a step back and say, well, what can we do to protect ourselves? What can we do given what we know, given what we see? Are there ways to improve certainly the protection of our enterprise users, where we have the potential to apply tools, whether they're on the network or off the network, to give additional layers of protection and prevention for these kind of phishing attacks? Now, I've mentioned already that phishing campaigns are short-lived, and this was some research that we found that actually came from Google at Black Hat, and it showed a really surprising figure to me of just how short some of these campaigns are. An enterprise-focused bulk campaign where maybe you're trying to email all of the individuals within an enterprise over a period of time may only last for 13 hours. But for a boutique campaign, maybe something where I'm doing very targeted phishing, I'm only looking at the executives, I'm only trying to get very specific individual information, those domains may only be live literally for a matter of minutes, not even a matter of hours. So you have a significant challenge here. Traditional techniques that protect against phishing typically rely on the URLs that are being identified in the phishing campaign being identified, detected, and then added to a blacklist, for example, that would be applied at a firewall from an outbound traffic perspective. Well, unfortunately, that means obviously you have a period of time from when the campaign begins before the URL is detected, and then an additional period of time from when that URL is detected to when it's actually added to your blacklist. So there's a significant security gap, as you can see with the curve on the graph here. Now, one of the tools and techniques that was used previously is to look at the time of registration for a domain, a new domain, if it's one that the firewall has not seen before, and look how new that domain has been created. Unfortunately, again, the scammers have become very familiar with this technique of inspection. So now they create the URLs that they're likely to use in a phishing campaign weeks or months in advance and effectively just keep them stored, ready to use. So unfortunately, that time of registration between registration and activation is not a good indicator of whether a particular domain is a phishing domain. So you can see on this graph that there is a significant security gap from when the campaign begins to the URL being detected, and the URL is typically detected due to an individual getting compromised via phishing. Then that's validated, reported, and then over time that URL gets added to the appropriate security and data feeds that go into the blacklists in various routers. And then at that point, an enterprise organization is protected And at some point, that URL will be deactivated because it's no longer of use to the phishing scammers, and they'll move on to the next domain, and we go through the whole same process again. Now, you might think, well, phishing really is just a consumer challenge, and from an enterprise perspective, I don't need to be too worried about it. But if you remember back to the figures that I showed earlier, 1/3 of the URLs that we analyzed in our State of the Internet report were focused on enterprise organizations. We've seen a significant shift in these phishing kits evolving beyond the traditional sort of consumer 3-question and you're a winner type campaign, now to being very specifically focused on enterprise applications. We see phishing toolkits that are available that can impersonate corporate application sites, your Google Suite site, your Office 365 or SharePoint site, Adobe or Dropbox, and others. Basically, with these toolkits, you tell the toolkit what site you want to interpret and what you want to impersonate. And that toolkit effectively goes and scrapes all of the logos, all of the content, and creates all of the necessary pages that make it look like a very genuine Office 365 or Google Suite site. All you then need to provide as a phishing campaigner is obviously an appropriate domain that looks legitimate enough to trick a user into thinking that they are valid, they're visiting a valid site rather than a phishing site. So as part of our analysis, one of the things that we identified is that actually the output from these phishing toolkits that are being used can be identified and categorized. And what we did within Akamai was we actually built a capability in our cloud security intelligence to be able to analyze known phishing sites and the pages that these toolkits generate, and then create, for want of a better description, a forensic analysis and a digital fingerprint for what the output of those toolkits look like. So that then now gives us an indication or a pointer as to whether a potential site that someone is trying to visit is actually a legitimate site or a phishing site. Because we've seen that the output from these toolkits, as I say, can be analyzed and categorized to give us this digital footprint. So we've introduced a capability within Akamai in our cloud security web gateway proxy, or our SWG proxy, with something we call zero-day phishing detection and prevention. So what this means is when a user is now trying to connect to a domain that we've never seen before, instead of just checking the DNS name and allowing them to connect, or allowing them to connect and then inspecting any files that they're downloading, what we will first of all do, if we've never seen that domain before, is that we will go run our fingerprinting algorithm, our digital fingerprinting algorithm on that destination domain, and we will look and compare the fingerprint that we generate from that site against our existing database of phishing locations that we've already created digital analysis and fingerprints for. If we see a match between the fingerprint of the destination and a fingerprint or digital fingerprint within our database, then it's a very, very high percentage chance that the user is trying to visit a location that is actually a phishing site and is the result of the output of a phishing toolkit. Now think about that for a moment. This is a user trying to visit a domain that we've never seen before, that's never been used before. And yet we can go validate the destination and determine with a high degree of certainty that that domain is actually a phishing site, even though we've never seen the content and we've never seen that actual domain name before. So it's very, very powerful capability. And obviously, what's the impact of that? If you remember back to our propagation time graph, where we had a period of time when the domain was registered, then we had the start of the curve when the phishing campaign begins, and then we have time for the first detection, and then time for the URL to get into the blacklist. That gives us that period of time at the top graph, top diagram shows, where users are not protected in a traditional firewall-based list protection solution. But with this zero-day phishing or ZDP protection capability, remember we apply this to the very first time that we see a domain. So if the output matches a fingerprint, and if the output of that fingerprint shows that it's phishing, then we will block the user from connecting with a high degree of certainty that they're trying to connect to a phishing site. Hence why it's zero-day phishing. We've never seen the domain before. It's the very first time it's been used, and yet the user potentially is blocked from accessing that site. So a significant increase, I think, in the level of protection that you can provide to your user base with this increase in phishing threats. So let's just wrap up by looking at how that actually works. What you have from the Akamai solution is called Enterprise Threat Protector, is you have a secure web gateway platform built on Akamai's industry-leading global platform. The user tries to connect to the internet, and actually they have a client on their device that intercepts all their outbound web traffic and sends it to the Akamai platform for validation and inspection. We'll validate the domain name that they're trying to reach. We effectively become the DNS resolver, so we will validate that the domain name is legitimate. And if the traffic is web-based, then we'll do a full proxy-based onboarding of that traffic and compare the destinations, the URLs, and the domains that the individual is trying to connect to against our cloud security intelligence database. As I mentioned already, if this is a domain that we've never seen before, then actually we will go validate the destination against our fingerprinting algorithm to determine if it's a phishing site before we will allow the user to connect. We have the ability to integrate authentication into this whole process, whether that's using a traditional on-premise identity store like Active Directory or a third-party cloud-based identity provider such as Azure AD or G Suite. This then ensures and allows you to have the full audit capability to validate which users have gone to which destinations, allowing for much greater and more rapid investigation for any potential compromise that does happen on your network. And obviously, once the user is authenticated, once the domain has been validated to ensure that it is not a known threat or a suspicious phishing site, the user is allowed to connect to the internet, browse their content, and potentially download files from the internet. Built into the secure web gateway platform are 2 antivirus inspection engines that will validate any files that are downloaded. And you have the option of offloading those files for further dynamic analysis to the cloud-based sandbox. So again, you can validate the file not just using a static antivirus engine, but you can actually detonate that file live in a cloud sandbox to determine if it has any malicious impact or not. One of the great benefits of this approach, particularly relevant, I think, with the significant increase in obviously home working right now, is that using the client on the device as the on-ramp means that you get exactly the same levels of protection inspection for users when they're off the net, maybe working from home, that you would get for a user who's on the corporate network as well. So it ensures that you've got all of those same zero-day phishing protections, as well as all of the other layers of the secure web gateway functionality to protect your users irrespective of the locations. So what would I recommend the next steps be? I've taken you through details of the sort of phishing economies, why phishing is something that continues to be an important topic. And I would strongly recommend that you go download Akamai's State of the Internet report. It's called Phishing, Baiting the Hook. There's a link to it in the slides, and understand a little bit more about the business impact of phishing, and particularly how relevant it is for enterprise organizations, and understand that phishing is not just a consumer challenge, it is most definitely an enterprise challenge as well. I'd recommend and validate that your organization hasn't already been a victim of phishing. We have some tools within Akamai using our cloud-based products that allow you to run a health check and see if your users have been tricked into visiting phishing domains, or if, for example, there is post-compromise issues in your network, maybe malware communicating with command and control servers, etc. And finally, I'd recommend reaching out to Akamai to talk to us, to help us talk you through how these kind of tools and techniques, such as zero-day phishing, can help protect your users and help ensure the ongoing security of your organization in these challenging times. So with that, I'd like to thank you very much for taking the time to watch this webinar. I hope you found the information useful. Do feel free to reach out to me if you'd like more information. And obviously, I highly recommend that you visit the akamai.com/zero trust page on the internet to learn more about the Akamai solutions that are available. So again, I'm Nick Hawkins, Senior Director of Product Management for the Enterprise Business Unit in Akamai. I'd like to thank you all very much for your time. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.